All right, let's get started. So first of all, welcome everyone to the April edition of the Cerini Connection, where we bring in experts in the fields that are troubling you most to connect with you and provide you with insights and ideas. Today is a pretty special day. We welcome guests Joey Bottitta and Dennis Hast of OneGroup to discuss cybersecurity insurance, which I know is something that's really, really important to everyone these days. With someone being hacked roughly every minute, we need to make sure that everyone's protected. So first of all, thank you and welcome Joey and Dennis.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
So let's kind of just jump in there and pop up some questions. So with the increased threat of cyber attacks that are out there and all of the scams that we're seeing, we understand that cybersecurity is extremely important, but exactly what does cyber insurance cover?
Yeah, no, I mean, great place to start, Ken. So there is first-party coverages, third-party coverages, and then what I kind of call cybercrime coverages that are kind of related to first-party coverages. But going through those coverages, first-party coverages are things like, computer replacement, that's also called bricking or hardware, digital asset restoration, business interruption and extra expense, dependent business interruption, extortion and ransomware coverage, which is really important these days, breach response, crisis management, and public relations, just to name a few under first party. Third party coverages are when you're dealing with like network and security liability, when you've damaged somebody else potentially. Regulatory defense and penalties, PCI fines, which is payment cards, potential for bodily injury and property damage. And then, like I said, the cyber crime, which really is the social engineering and what we call fund transfer fraud. So where somebody, a threat actor, somehow impersonates somebody and gets you to transfer money to them instead of to the party that you meant to transfer to. Could be a contractor, could be a business associate. So those are the primary areas that we see those coverages.
Okay, and
Right.
Sorry, Joey, did you have something you want to add?
No, okay. I was just going to add to that. One of the things also that's very different about cyber insurance is that the coverages differ and the terminology differs with each carrier, where most insurances like property insurance are standardized. It's not standardized. Dennis and I also, referred it to the Wild West. So you have to be very careful about the policies you have.
So when you talk about, sorry, I was going to say, when you talk about things being
listening.
standardized and non-standardized, maybe can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing out there in terms of, what people should be looking out for in terms of what's standardized and what's not?
Yeah, so that's a great question and great point, Joey. So unlike most other insurances where they follow what's called the ISO form, so all policies are kind of created equal for the most part. Languages are very similar, coverages are very similar. Cyber is completely different. Every carrier has their own form, their own names for certain coverages, their own endorsements and exclusions. So you really need somebody to focus in on that particular policy to let you know the good points and the bad points of it. Some things to look out for are, how do they handle, named malware? How do they handle extortion ransomware? Is it covered in full? Is it only half the limit? Is there co-insurance? How do the deductibles work? Is the policy a pay on behalf of, which means the carrier will just pay for that loss, the extortion, or any of the other expenses directly? Or is it a reimbursement where you actually have to pay it and then seek reimbursement from the carrier? So those are kind of the main things, but really every policy is different, and you really need somebody to look and read that policy and understand the differences in it. And one other thing along this thing is, there's another big difference here is you find people that have what's called add-on coverage, which are endorsements typically to their property or GL, or standalone cyber policies. Those endorsement type cyber coverages are very limited in the scope and the coverage they provide. You really want to have a standalone cyber policy to give you the best coverage.
So if you have all of these different pieces and different components, what are the primary things that people should be looking for in a policy? What are the, obviously, there's going to be a differential in price and stuff like that based upon all the different components. What are the things that are essential that has to be or should be in a cybersecurity policy?
Well, you want to know what your own exposure is, right? So one of the things that's different on all policies is kind of your bring your own device aspect of it. So whether a device is company owned or personally owned, some policies cover all those bring your own devices, other policies don't. So if you have a lot of non-company owned devices connecting to your network that could, eventually cause a cyber event, it's important to make sure that your policy has those coverages. I would say that that's key. It's also knowing what the policy covers and don't cover. And like I mentioned, like there's sometimes you'll see exclusions now for certain malware that's named, or certain events that have happened out there, or if you don't patch your system in a timely manner, that it's going to limit your coverage, where maybe the first 0 to 30 or 45 days, you'll have 100% of coverage. But then after that, it slowly starts ticking off percentages till maybe after 180 days, you may have 0 coverage. So it's important to read all of those sections to make sure it's, you understand what they say and that it's applicable to your organization.
And I would add, Ken, that, because, we have a big audience here, and there are some people who are more sophisticated than others when it comes to insurances. This is insurance where you want to get help. Unless you have that background knowledge and can speak Dennis's language, quite frankly, because sometimes I listen to him and say, what are you talking about, right? With some of the terminology can be very, very foreign to somebody. But I think the keys to the main question is, what's most important? It's all important, but the first party, third party, those big generalizations are key. And knowing, some of the companies now are not giving any what's called fund transfer fraud coverage, right? Or cybercrime coverage. That would be, a big no-no, really, in our estimation, because that's probably the leading type of claim that's going on now, in addition to being shut down, breached, and being held for ransom. So, but to Dennis's point, you need to know your own risk first, because some people may do massive credit cards. Some people might be not-for-profits that, not only want to protect their employees and the number of employees, but their donors and donor lists and things of that nature. Certainly the revenue plays a lot, Dennis, with underwriting. How big your company is revenue-wise is going to generate the premium and the kinds of coverages that you have. So just want to say it gets a little complicated. We don't need to be so technical, but it is a technical area right now.
It is. And a couple of other things along this line too, Ken and Joey, is that sometimes your, IT guy is not a cybersecurity, guy. So they might be really good at imaging, your surfaces and your laptops and getting them hooked to the network and running, but they may not fully understand cybersecurity. So you want to make sure you have somebody that understands cybersecurity. Couple of other things is you want to make sure whichever policy you're getting, it has pre-loss services, and that you take advantage of those pre-loss services. Sometimes carriers will offer you almost a suite of cybersecurity where because it benefits them, that they're constantly scanning the wild, seeing what's happening out there, see if there's certain vulnerabilities that are leading to losses. And if they notice that you have that vulnerability, they'll actually contact you to say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Policyholder, we've noticed that there's this new vulnerability out there. We think you may have it. Here's what you need to do to create it. So they're kind of helping you. You want to make sure that these policies allow for full prior acts coverage, because most of them are all claims made. So you never want to be in a situation where you don't have coverage for something because you're reporting it today, but on average, these threat actors are in your system for, like 212 days. So you never want to come to that situation where you may not know if you actually have coverage. So understand that prior acts are full prior unknown acts standpoint, and then understand the triggers on the different policies. Some people tell me, well, I have cybercrime coverage on my crime or my property policy. Why do I need a cyber policy to cover it? And the answer for that is really the triggers. It's how did that loss occur as to how that policy is going to react. So I know a little technical, Ken, but this is one of those areas you kind of need to get into the weeds.
I was going to say, you brought up a couple things, and You kind of elaborated a little bit on one of them, but I want to kind of explore this a little bit more. I mean, since this is such a technical area, since this is such an area that requires a certain level of expertise, I mean, to what extent do you, when you're working with the company, do you interface with the company's IT staff? And to what extent should a company ensure that their IT staff is involved in this process, as opposed to just leaving it to fiscal or someone else within the organization?
It's a great question, Ken, and I will tell you all the time right now. So I talk to, at some point during the renewal phase, almost all of our clients' IT folks, you know, whether it's in-house or external, because most of the applications now are becoming very technical, and you need that IT person to complete the application. Sometimes, sadly, it comes out that maybe that IT company isn't doing the right thing for the client, and it kind of comes out through this process a little bit that they haven't put all of the things in place that they should to really develop a good cyber hygiene and a good cyber resiliency. So it's pretty constant. I mean, just today I talked to two separate clients and two of their IT folks. And the importance of this is to really get out, and we can talk about it more later, is to get out ahead of these renewals in the cyber insurance early. You're looking at like that 4 to 6 month window. You almost want to get an assessment done if you can from your cyber carrier, if you have one. If not, get a cyber assessment done, identify what your vulnerabilities are, work on them so that you can get them corrected. By getting the application and starting the process early, is you can identify that client's vulnerabilities and start the work on correcting them. Right now, one of the problems in the industry is that there's not as much capacity as there was, and there's a lot of nervousness from carriers about the potential for breaches. So they're kind of cherry picking the accounts that they want to write coverage for, and they want to have a lot of things in place in order to even get basic limits. So you want to have those in place before you send that application to the marketplace, because if you're working on those things, it's as good as not having those in place, and you'll get a lot of declinations from the marketplace. So you really need to get out ahead, help your cyber hygiene and resiliency, get those mandated, those must-haves in place, and we can talk about those if you want, Ken, well before your renewal date comes up.
Right. And I would just add to that too, going back to internal or external, you know, there's contracts involved with the external, and we have found you really want to be mindful to that as well. So you might have a contract with a cloud-based company, you might have a contract with a cybersecurity company, other companies that might handle the hardware and, you know, the networking. Check your indemnity clauses in your contract, because what we're finding is that many of them limit their liability to the cost of the contract, the fee. And, you know, we haven't gotten into cost of claims yet, but the cost of an actual claim has really escalated, oftentimes much, much more than the, you know, the limited liability you might have in that contract. Certainly, you know, from a company standpoint, the larger you are, the more, you know, leverage you have to negotiate that, you know, as opposed to, you know, Dennis and I have small, you know, clients that have small businesses, and it's really tough for them too, because most of which they need to outsource. But there are some, you know, companies out there that can definitely assist with the small business sector, as well as we find the large business sector, not for profit or profit, it doesn't really matter here, can go to those bigger companies for those services.
So that pulls us in like a bunch of different directions here, because we touched on like 27 different topics that we can. So I guess the first path is, and Joey, you were just kind of talking about large versus small, and Dennis, in terms of some of the things you were talking about, you know, you can go and you can do this, you can do that, you can talk to your IT person, you can talk to your cybersecurity person. What happens if you're a small organization? You don't have all these people. You don't have all these people to talk to. You know, how do they figure out what they need to do? Because we have a lot of, you know, smaller organizations and smaller companies who are kind of listening in on this. How do they figure out what they need? How do they figure out what they're supposed to do? How do they keep themselves in a position where they can get coverage?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ken, again. And it's really about, you know, reaching out to kind of a trusted resource, you know, whether it's Joey and I or somebody else that they know that is in tune with the current cybersecurity market and can help them. For those smaller clients, it is scary because in most cases, they don't have that cybersecurity group that they work with or individuals within their organizations. And kind of a sad statistic is that about 60% of small businesses fail within 6 months after a cyber attack because they haven't done those things to be able to recover from it, right? So they don't have cyber insurance, they haven't developed a plan to recover, and sadly they fail within it. So in many cases in these small organizations, some of the things we'll talk about later is the industry has not mandated that they have all these things in place. So depending on their size, under 10 million in revenue, if they only have access to a certain amount of PHI, personal health information, or PII, personal identifiable information, if they only house a little bit of that, we can still get good cyber policies at a relatively inexpensive, price for those type of companies. But it's becoming harder and harder to get, as time goes on because the market is really constricting. So you do need to kind of find a partner that can help you kind of walk through it and understand what your exposure is and what you may need for coverages.
You're kind of coming up with this kind of scary little story here about the fact that there's a big need, but maybe not a big answer for that need in terms of what people are offering. How do we know if we're getting a good plan? How do we know if we have the right amount of insurance? How do we know any of these things? And what should we, obviously talking to you guys is an answer, but what should we be doing and what should we be looking for?
Yeah, you really need to look at your organization and see what the potential loss is, right? So look from an asset standpoint, how many endpoints, how many devices do you have connected to your network? Cell phones, laptops, tablets, printers, servers, all of that type of stuff. So if all of that was to fail, what would that cost be to recover? So that'll give you one kind of indication. On average, for every record that's been compromised, it's about $160. So that personal identifiable information or personal health information, it's on average about $160 per record when that gets stolen. But in the healthcare arena, that goes up to about $500 per record. So it starts to exponentially grow pretty quickly. So it gives you an idea of what you need to cover. And these cyber criminals now are smart, Ken. They know enough to, when they get into your system and they move laterally, to look at your financials, to identify how much money does this company have? What's that sweet spot I should ask for ransom? Because they don't want to ask for too little and not maximize their take, and they don't want to ask for too much that they know the company can't pay. So they have a formula, an internal formula based on your revenues, how much they should ask for. And right now, if you look at the statistics, they look grossly high for small and medium-sized businesses. IBM says the average cost of a breach is about $4.24 million, which is a huge number for any organization. But I could tell you, for most of the organizations I work with, especially in the not-for-profit social service sector, when they've had a loss, it's been in the hundreds of thousands of dollars that the loss has been, and not necessarily in the multi-millions of dollars. On average, I would say almost any company, a baseline of what they should be looking for is $1 million in coverage. Usually, depending on your size, you want to kind of weigh that deductible. Smaller companies that really can't absorb a lot of loss want to have a low retention, maybe $1,000 or $2,500. Larger companies that can absorb a loss, maybe you're looking at 10 or 15, 25, even $100,000 to retain that loss to keep the premiums low.
Got it. Makes sense. We're seeing, and you mentioned this earlier, that bring your own device type of stuff. With more and more people working from home, and companies maybe losing a little bit of understanding how people are tapping into their systems and stuff. How important is it for organizations and companies to have policies in place? How does that get looked at by the insurance companies, and what do they need to do to ensure that these policies are being followed in terms of policies established for their staff?
Yeah, it's been a huge change, Ken, from that aspect. So we got kind of BC before COVID and now after COVID, it's a different world now, right? I mean, there's so many people that work from home, and there is a huge vulnerability for people that use their own devices for work. Whether you connect to your company network through a VPN or anything else, if you're using your personal device, that you're accessing social media, Facebook, everything else on that, downloading applications, downloading software that may or may not be malicious, and then connecting into your work environment, it does provide a vector, for threat actors to get in. Ideally, what we like to see is that you're using a work provided device that has been imaged and the security added to that device, and you're only using that for work. And then you have your own personal device that you're using for personal. And I'm not really talking about a phone so much. I'm really talking more about tablets and surfaces and laptops. To the point, even from a personal standpoint, we always recommend to people, listen, if you're a gamer and you do a lot of online shopping and you do Facebook and all that type of stuff, have one device at home that you do that with, and then have another device at home that you do your banking and your financial wealth management with, your investments, your 401k, your 403b, all of that with. Don't commingle those things, because you're just exposing yourself to a potential loss, even from a personal standpoint.
Right, makes sense. What are you seeing, or where are you seeing now over the last couple of years with the cyber attacks getting smarter? Where are you seeing some of the exposures that companies have that they really should be looking at?
So one of the areas that's becoming really scary is two things: spear phishing, which is different than regular phishing. So spear phishing is focused on a certain individual, and normally these spear phishings are focused on C-suite individuals, because most C-suite individuals have a public profile either through LinkedIn or Facebook or anything else, that talks about the charities that they're involved with and the things that they do and the things that the company focuses on. And it gives that threat actor all of that background information to figure out, how do I attack and get into this network? So if you're focused on, a certain charity like a food bank or Meals on Wheels or something like that, they can spoof an email from them and send you something malicious that you think looks fine, but you're going to open it up and allow them to get into your network. The other thing that's taking place that's pretty high tech is this fund transfer fraud. So they're into your system, they're monitoring your email, they see who you're communicating with, they may be looking at invoices either going out or coming in, and they can pick a large one out. So you're having some construction done, you owe this contractor, a few $100,000 or a few $1 million, depending on what you're having done. You get notice from that contractor that, hey, by the way, we just moved banks. Here's our new banking information and routing number. So when you send our next payment, that's where it should go. They're getting so sophisticated that they now have, and I'm sure you've seen deep fakes of like Tom Cruise or anything else. They can now impersonate that person either visually or from a voice standpoint, that when you're picking up the phone and calling the CFO or the CEO to validate that you should be doing that wire transfer and they confirm it, or you're calling that client to do it, they've now mimicked their voice and mimicked them that it sounds like it's appropriate to do it. And now you go and transfer that money. And the recommendation from that is, if you know that individual, you should be picking up the phone and calling them. And even though it can be mimicked, asking them questions that they would know the answer to, even ones that that are false, that's saying, hey, how did that vacation go with you and your wife Mary? When the wife's name isn't Mary, or that they're not married, or you asked about a kid that that they don't have, something just to kind of trick them up. But it's getting very sophisticated with that, Ken, and that fund transfer fraud has been stepping up pretty quickly. It was usually tens of thousands of dollars. Now I think the average is like $375,000 is the average fund transfer fraud.
That's
And
big.
I just going to interject, because now everybody's got agita, right? I'm listening to it, but the going back to what fits your organization. That's a prime example, fund transfer forward. We have some clients who say, but I don't make those kind of transfers. I don't do that. And then you have other clients that do it all the time. And to what degree and to what amount? Because as we said earlier in the conversation, one of the things about the coverages that you really want to be mindful here, I know we've talked about a lot of things, is the fund transfer for coverage. There's some carriers that won't offer it altogether. So if you're doing fund transfer as part of your business operations, then clearly that's a coverage you need, as opposed if you're not really doing it, then maybe you don't need that part of it. And that's another distinction between your crime policy about how, Dennis said, what's the trigger, right? Well, the trigger there in the illustration he gave you was a cyber breach, right? So if you have crime coverage on its own or have it as part of your property insurance, you're probably not going to have coverage under that policy. Another reason why you want a standalone policy. And I guess the other pieces we'll get to, because we're mindful of the time, that are important. We've talked a couple of times of they're in your system already. Typically on a cyber breach, it's not like you have the fire in your house and you see the fire and it's that day. Typically they're in your system 200 days plus, spying on you before you even know it. And they're getting that information to determine when are they going to flip that switch, right, to cause the breach, the ransom, or the theft, the crime in some sort of way. So it's a little bit different than how we're all really more geared up towards that loss that we understand and how it happens. It happens quickly, more imminently, not so much on the cyber world. It's a whole different ballgame. So I know we're going to get into this in a couple of questions we have, but doesn't matter small or big here, if you have employees, there's training that has to happen now. Routine training with your staff, through some of the companies that can be outsourced or internally if you have the wherewithal, because it's so sophisticated now that, you're doing a disservice to your company if you don't have a certain amount of training with your staff to what to look out for and mindful for and tested, so just punting back to you guys, but I thought that was important to just kind of put out there.
Thanks, Joey. And it's like every time you guys talk, I get another 26 questions pop into my head. So, Dennis, you mentioned before that, when you're trying to determine how much coverage you need, you said it's a kind of a per document sort of, or per file sort of thing. What about, if I'm in a business where I've got, information for a client or something, and then there's the residual impact on that client and the push down through the client. I mean, can that client sue you for having that breach? How does that work with respect to your insurance, their insurance? What happens there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really good point on two sides of this. So you're absolutely right. If you are holding information on a client and you get breached, which causes them a loss, your policy is responsible for that. So that's that third party coverage that we talked about earlier. The better cyber policies that are out there also have what's called dependent business interruption. So when you have somebody that you rely on, whether it's a cloud provider or some IT provider, or even if you're making a manufacturer and you require parts, from somebody else to make your final product or a portion of that product, there's that dependency that you have there. Some cyber policies, the better ones, will provide you with some coverage for that, because now you can't operate because somebody else had a cyber event. So it'll actually provide you with some coverage. Some of the coverages are great. Maybe it's still at the full policy limits of $1 million or whatever you have. Some of them could be a little bit less. Some of them will focus only on IT type providers. Other ones have a little bit of a broader segmentation. So depending again on your risk, we have to look at those sections of the policy too and make sure we can get as broad a coverage as possible to protect you.
Right.
And I'm just going to add there, Ken, too, is when you're determining what you need, it's also who are your clients? Because as Dennis, mentioned, healthcare clients, school districts, where you're maintaining records of children or people and their medical information. you're that much more of a target to this cyber world because those records get so much more money in the black market. So that's going to sort of set the tone too of what the limits are, and how far you need to go is the volume of it, but also the kind of information that you're holding in your company.
But wouldn't that be the case for almost any company with respect to employee records and personnel files and everything else, where you've got social security numbers, you've got probably direct deposit information and everything else?
100%, but
Yeah.
now add to it, and it's not to minimize that or to say that that's not important, and but now you have a healthcare setting where your client is 500 patients that not only have the financial information but have their medical information, right? Their health history, or children who are in schools that aren't even yet 18. And that information being stolen and the damage of it not really being visible because they're not out there applying for a credit card or applying for this or for that. So they don't even know that their identity has been stolen and used. That is way more valuable on the black market. And then because of that breach, the breach itself becomes way more costly to address.
Right. So I know, Joey, you were talking about staff training. So obviously we're here talking about cyber insurance, but what else can people do in terms of helping themselves in terms of lessening the impact or lessening the chance of cyber attacks? You mentioned training, but I'm sure there's other things too, and maybe talk a little bit about that training. And how does that translate to lower premiums for insurance companies if you can prove you're doing this stuff, or does it not?
Yeah.
And it definitely does.
Actually,
Yeah, go ahead.
Joey, if it's okay, I'll kind of take
Yeah.
this. So I'll take this in two phases. I'll take one, what carriers are looking for to get the best price and the best coverage. And then I'll give you kind of best practices that you should be doing regardless if it's insurance related or not. So from an insurance standpoint right now, almost all carriers are looking for MFA, which is multi-factor authentication on your email and as well as on remote access. So that's that extra step where either you have some type of token that you get some code off of, or you have a push to your email or to your cell phone to acknowledge that it's you. That's really important right now. So you have to secure the email and the remote access. EDR, which stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. This is kind of a malware intrusion identification system and kind of monitoring. So it's looking at all of your endpoints, your printers, your servers, your laptops, anything that's connected to your network to see if anything nefarious is happening at those or questionable, and then allowing you to go in and do some research. Having that email security in place, encrypting all of your sensitive data. Having
Dennis, I don't mean to interrupt, but just one question. You're talking about going back and checking all the points into your system. But I think this goes back also to what you were talking about, people working from home and stuff like that. How do you know what points are getting into the system? How do you know how people are getting in? Does the system automatically know that in terms of checking it? Or does the company really need to understand how people are accessing?
Yeah, no, the better endpoint detection and response systems is actually pushing out software to anything that's connected to your network. So it's installing that on those endpoints, and then it's setting up monitoring of those endpoints so that if something questionable is happening on those, it's being reported in a log and being monitored so that you can address it almost in real time. So the old kind of endpoint detection was just that it was out there kind of detecting if stuff were happening and throwing it on a log, but it was only good if somebody was actually going into looking at the log. Now it's a more active monitoring to say, hey, Mr. Client, there's a problem on your system. We're noticing this at this endpoint. So it's kind of continuing to advance. And kind of along those lines for the insurance, it's really segmenting some of your information, not housing it all in one place. What's called kind of in the IT world a honeypot, where if they get into your system, they can gain access to that honeypot, and then it's kind of game over because now they have all that information. It's getting rid of and replacing all of that end of life or end of supported software, having backups in place and making sure that you can access them, and starting it like we've talked about, getting 4 to 6 months out, starting that process, getting some vulnerabilities assessments done and reacting to it. That's kind of what carriers are looking for. But again, I don't want this to be all doom and gloom, and I want people to know that there's some proactive things that they can do. So we talked about a lot of these already, right? It's the email security and phishing training. It's the implementing the MFA that we talked about. It's having good backups that are encrypted, air gapped, which means kind of like the old days, you pull the file right out and you stick it on a shelf. You can't do that any day, right? Because everything's all electronic storage now, but it's having one of your backups that's completely air gapped, not connected to the internet, not plugged in, that's just sitting there isolated. And you want to be able to test to make sure that you can restore from your backups. You want to secure all remote access like we talked about. You want to update and patch regularly. Every Tuesday, CISA puts out new patches and new vulnerabilities that need to be patched. Make sure that whoever your IT company is or IT security company is, they're patching those, that you're using good password managers or passphrases to make it hard for people to get into your system. We're using EDR, encrypting all the data. Joey talked about using favorable third-party contracts, third-party vendor contracts, business associated agreements. Make sure they're favorable to you. Create and practice the cyber incident response plan. That's huge because time is of the essence so many times. If you have a breach, what are you going to do about it? Like if you have cyber insurance, do you know who to call at the carrier? When do you call the carrier? If you don't have cyber insurance, do you have things set up already with forensics, with a cyber attorney, people that can help you out?
And I think, by way of when I say testing, as these best practices, just for example, and again, it's going to depend on the size of your company and what you're able to do, what you're able to afford. But the outside services, there are outside services that do this, and then there's, for the larger companies, internally can be set up. But I would say, our system just in our own company has a little, in front of our Outlook, a suspicious email. We hit that, right? That's part of the thing. If I think it's suspicious, I hit it. It goes into IT world. It goes away from me, and they email me back and say it was suspicious or it wasn't. Sometimes they do that on purpose as a test, and I'm bad, right? Because I'm going so fast, right? Everybody works so fast. I miss that. My client is one eye, but they put two in it, or something like that. Or everybody got their year-end bonuses, and I get an email saying, hey, we need to talk about your year-end bonus. So those are the tests that actually happen either through an outsourced company, through you, that you're sending to your employees to see if they click. And I could tell you, because I'm an offender, I don't like to be, but it makes you have to slow down, because part of the testing in our company is if you blow it twice, they shut your computer down and you have to go take an online course. And I can't do any work. I completely shut down. That's how strict it's become. If you really have enough there in your company that needs to be protected. And then, I know there's just for some of the smaller companies out there, there are companies that you can outsource, and it's sort of a la carte about whether they're going to monitor you, whether they'll do the testing for you, all the different things that we're talking about today. If you don't have the wherewithal to pull it in, and if you currently have cyber insurances, most of the companies have some free resources as part of the policy that you want to look up and take advantage of.
Take advantage of those, absolutely.
Yeah, you had mentioned, Dennis, the Prelaw services.
Yep.
How do people avail themselves to those Prelaw services? What are those Prelaw services, and what can they do in terms of helping the organization?
Yeah, so if you have cyber insurance, usually right at renewal time or the first time you write it, they're pushing out a notice to whoever the designated person is at the company to say, we have this dashboard available to you. We have these services available to you. We have this portable, this portal available to you. You need to sign up. So if you've never done that, you should do that. If you're uncertain what services are out there from your carrier, reach out to your broker, have them provide you with the information for that, because in almost every case, there are some resources available. Some are better than others. And sometimes we place insurance based on giving clients that better, pre-law services that, like I mentioned, could be monitoring, could be advising them if there's a loss, could be phishing exercises, could be discounts on putting cybersecurity into place. some carriers limit, from a dollar standpoint, how much they're going to give you. Other ones just kind of almost have an open book saying, we want you to take advantage of all of these, because if you don't have a cyber loss, we don't have to pay anything. So it's a win-win.
Right. Makes sense. Totally makes sense. You also mentioned, Dennis, that you were talking about what happens if an organization gets hacked, and you should have certain things lined up and everything else. But maybe take us through quickly the steps that you got to think about when an organization gets hacked.
Yeah. So you want to react as quickly as you possibly can. If you have a cyber policy, hopefully that cyber policy has what's called a breach coach, which is someone in their claims department who's typically an attorney, because you want to make sure an attorney's involved, and we'll talk about that in a second, because you want that person to then get forensics involved pretty quickly so that they can walk through with your IT folks what to do and what not to do. Because what you don't want to do is immediately unplug everything and disconnect everything, because you could lose valuable logs. So you want to have somebody that knows what they're talking about tell you what to do. And you want to have that attorney involved so that they can start to protect the information, because there are a lot of laws and regulations out there about who you need to notify, when you need to notify them. If you have to notify them, you really need a good cyber attorney to do that, because you don't want to just run out and tell the FBI or the state police that you had a breach if you maybe didn't have a breach, or if you still need to gather information to see what you need to do, even from a HIPAA compliance. So I personally think that's your best call, is to reach out to that carrier to kind of get that started, because if you spend any money before you report it, it may not be covered under the policy. So you want to be able to kind of get them spending money if that's going to be the case. Hit your deductible, push all that cost onto them, and don't eat additional cost. If you don't have cyber insurance, part of your incident plan should be, do we have a cyber attorney that we can contact first? What about forensic ITs? Like, who do we have set up? And have we done a tabletop exercise with them so that everybody understands what everybody's doing in case there's an event? So that's why you kind of need to really pre-plan this out, Ken, so if an event does take place.
So this comes back to what you said several times. You need to have in place an incident plan. So all companies should really be sitting down and developing a formalized incident plan. So if an incident happens, they know what the steps to take are. Sorry, Joey, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's exactly what it is. So we're calling them even to run a drill, right? So some of the larger companies, and we're starting to see this regulatory too. So back in March of 2020, smack in the middle of, COVID hitting, the New York State SHIELD Act came out. And that's the regulatory body. Now, there really hasn't been much bite to it, I think, because it came out right with COVID. But I don't think that that's going to go away. And depending on your company size, by way of revenue, number of employees, there's different requirements now of what you want to do. And so for those larger companies, having a breach response plan is a requirement. I think to be proactive, because we're also busy with so many different things, to round up your, the thinkers, right? The decision makers of the company, no matter how big or how large, small, say, look, we need to do this. Let's get this on the radar, because it's being proactive and really saying what's going to happen. What systems do you have? All the companies today are all different. They do different things, right? But, healthcare is attached to an electronic medical record or health record, right? There's a system. Some healthcare is set up to pharmacy, school districts set up to BOCES, right? BOCES has had a number of breaches. So if you really want to look, manufacturing and links, everybody has some sort of systems, right? And the more systems you have, the more planning. You need to have Dennis, we can show what happens is, if everyone's looking at the computer screen right now, what happens on a ransom is your screen turns into like a screen that says, we got you, you're under ransom, contact us, you're shut down. It literally happens just like that. So we're running low on time. I just want to throw out one more question before we wrap up. So, there's been a big push for companies to move to the cloud from, dedicated servers into the cloud. Is one safer than the other? Is there really any difference between the two of them, or does it really come down to how you prepare?
It really does come down to, Ken, how you prepare, right? If you don't have the right cybersecurity, resiliency, hygiene in place. Doesn't really matter if you're using your own servers or kind of a rent-a-server kind of situation, or if you're using the cloud. There is some built-in cybersecurity with the clouds, but those are really the high-name ones. When you're dealing with, Amazon and those type of services, they have some pretty high-level cybersecurity, but they still get hacked. I mean, Amazon got hacked, I think it was about a year ago or so. So they still can have issues. So it doesn't preclude you from having to set things up.
I can
And
tell
I'd
you
also
that.
add to that.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
no, okay, I was just gonna say, also add to that, that there's a misnomer falsely saying, well, it's all in the cloud, so I have nothing to worry about. But it's not true, right? You could lose your data in the cloud, they could get breached and it's gone. So
I was
little
going
bit
to
of a
say,
misnomer.
I can tell you when I go to bed tonight, I'm going to have nightmares because of this. So thank you for that. So it's no longer the monster sleeping under my bed. It's the cybersecurity attacks that are gonna keep me up at night. So thanks. Thank you. This was amazing. You guys shared some incredible information, and I think everybody who attended today is in agreement that this was really, really a great presentation. So thank you very much for the interview.
Happy to.
So everybody tune in on May 12th when our guest will be Paul Wolf, co-founder and president of Denham Wolf Real Estate Services. We're going to be looking at real estate concerns, how to utilize your space more effectively, options for renegotiating leases, and more. So please join us. And thanks everybody for being part of this. Appreciate it. Take care, guys.
Thank you, Ken, we appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.